Hello. As this part of the slide says, my name is Steve, and as this part of the slide says, I'm a bit of a geek. If we haven't been Zoom bombed, you are in a session called Engaging Developers, or as it might also be known, Why People Are Not Buying Your Product. Not yours, you're fine. Not you, you're also fine. Just you. So over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, we're going to go through the basic problems that are involved in getting a developer into your product. We're going to look at some of the causes of that, and then we'll look at the solution. And I say solution, I'm just going to outline one thing that you can do right now that will instantly garner more interest from developers, and more importantly, keep them interested once you've got them on board. I'll then finish up with a few random thoughts that I think will be pertinent to the conversation. Before we do any of that, we'll start with who am I? What have I done to earn a place on this video stream? Or as it should probably be called, the ego slide. This is where the speaker brags about themselves for 10 minutes while everyone else looks for the fast forward button. So I am essentially a developer. I've always been a developer. I've been a junior developer, a mid-level, senior, CTO, and I've always been doing something on the programming side. I've never been a marketing person. I've never been a CEO person. I've always been interested in the technology, how the technology works, how I can make the technology work for other people. I've done this in various fields. I've done it in education technology, I've done it in games, I've done embedded systems, quite a lot, quite varied. And I've also written some books about the subject. I've written various magazine articles on the subjects, and I've a fairly regular appearance at TADHack. I've been doing this since, I think, 2005, been writing various hacks and submitting them, and don't have that bad a track record. So far, I think I've won 9 prizes all told. But that's not important. That's not a humble brag. That's not important. What's important is what's not on that slide. There's something which is completely missing from that. I've never worked at a telecoms company. At all. Ever. I've used telecoms. I've used programmable telecoms. I've paid money to various companies to let me use their API and use their infrastructure. I've built WebRTC platforms and products, and I've built entire companies around the functionality of WebRTC, but I've never actually worked for a telecoms company. So in essence, I am your customer, or more precisely, I am your potential customer. So let's go through some of the things that would cause a stumbling block for me coming in to use the product. First off, what is the problem? What is it we're actually trying to solve here? And the real problem, as I've said, is developers are not engaging with the product. It might be that we come in and we try 1 or 2 API calls, and then we stop. Why are we stopping? Why are we not getting any further? Maybe we go to the home page, we say, oh, this looks interesting, we download the SDK, and then we stop. Again, the same problem. Developers are not engaging. Sometimes the developers might engage a little bit. They might sign up, they might get their API keys and their tokens, and they might make some calls, but then they never explore the rest of the functionality that your APIs are providing. Why is that? How can you get them going deeper into the product, learning more? Because if you can get them learning more about the product, they're less likely to leave at a later stage, and if they're engaged and they understand, they might help other people, which will minimize the support calls on your side. So that's essentially the main problem that I'm looking to solve here. The cause? Onboarding. You need to get a developer that knows absolutely nothing about your product and probably knows nothing about telecoms, to being someone that understands telecoms, embraces telecoms, and is able to do something with your platform. Just think about the information gulf between your engineers building this system and the developers that want to use it. It's quite a big difference. So you have to find a way to bridge that gap. That's not necessarily as easy as it sounds. We'll come to some of the problems associated with that later on. And finally, the solution. As I said, I'm going to talk about a primary solution that by thinking about your documentation and your information in a very particular way, you'll suddenly realize that there is a lot more that can be done. And I'll be using the word documentation throughout the solution part of the talk to mean all kind of information that you impart as an API provider or an SDK provider to an end user. And then I'll end up in the last few minutes or so just talking about the additional thoughts that I have around this area. As I say, I don't work in telecoms, but I am someone that uses telecoms and have advocated for APIs and platforms in other industries. So what I'm saying is not necessarily gospel truth, but it is my opinion on what I as a developer will be looking for and the things that I as a developer find cause friction to make me not want to use an API. So we've looked a little bit on the problem and the cause. The main part, which I'm sure everyone is interested in is the solution. And for this, it reminds me of a very old tale that gets told often. For that, I shall do what my university lecturers always used to refer to as a mid-lecture activity. So, there's an oft-quoted story about two men and a crocodile. The men are walking along and they see the crocodile with its snappy little jaws. And one man looks at the other, stops, and puts on his running shoes. The other chap looks at him and says, "What? How? Do you really expect to outrun a crocodile?" The man goes, "No, I just need to outrun you." And that, in essence, is the core of the problem. It's not that you're trying to outrun a crocodile. You just need to outrun another product. You just need to do something that little bit better, reduce that little bit of friction. After all, I'm a web developer. As a web developer, like pretty much all web developers, we don't have time. We'll get an API, we'll get a module, we'll get a library. If it does what we need, we'll use it. If it works straight away, fantastic. If it takes more than a half an hour, say, to get into that API, to get it running, to see what it's capable of, we may well move to the next API that only takes 20 minutes. It might sound very foolhardy and impatient. Unfortunately, the harsh reality is it's a feature for us. If we are doing SMS for two-factor authentication, for example, which is a very popular example, I do not want to have to go through 20 hoops to be able to support that piece of functionality. For me, it's one feature. For you, it's a massive part of your infrastructure. Sending SMS messages are completely and utterly important. They are vital. Granted, no problem with that. But for you, you will be spending a lot of time making sure that system is working. And at the end of the day, all I care about is sending a message and getting a succeed or a fail case. So there's a very big discrepancy on what the two halves of the equation want. And a lot of the companies that have done really well at programmable telecoms, mentioning no Twilio names, have done well because they realised they're not a telecoms company. They are a software company that happens to do telecoms. And by thinking in this way, you can provide something that closely matches what the developers expect rather than what you were wanting to provide. So let's look at the solution now and break it down into an overall idea. And this idea is very simple. Treat the documentation as if it were a product in its own right. As I said, I'm going to use the word documentation throughout to explain all forms of information that pass between you and a developer. This could mean a page, or it could be a blog, or it could be a PDF, or it could be the API reference. Whatever it is, I'm just going to refer to it as a whole as documentation. Treat all of it as its own product. That's kind of important. And this means you have to have all the same things in place as you would for a product. To start with, you need the vision. So by vision, I'm talking about the interaction between you and your APIs and your third-party developers. Because it is essentially a user interface. You've got to collect the mindset of this developer and your developers. Do they have the same mental model of the software and how it works? And even if they do, are your APIs mirroring that mental model? It's no good having one part of the API for voice that works with HTTP GET requests and PUT requests and a nice little RESTful interface, and then having the rest of the system that relies on SOAP or a completely different type of technology. It's not difficult to unify them, and it should really be on your side. Again, if we have to spend time putting a REST wrapper around a SOAP API, that's a barrier to entry for the web developers. And there are going to be more web developers wanting to use your product than there are you. There's one of you. A lot of web developers. So you want to make it easy for them by saying, look, that thing you learned to do voice is the same thing you use to use the SMS system. Again, it's another way of getting people into the product, letting them explore more, because it doesn't add friction every time they want to use a new part of the API or a new part of the system. And by the way, there's a misnomer that all web developers are using serverless or microservices. They're not. Or if they are, they're probably not doing it well. I started doing this serverless thing in 2011 because it looked new and cool and interesting. And it's true, it is interesting. But the idea that we're all doing serverless brilliantly and we are using 20 different APIs and 20 languages because we can, because it's serverless, is a misnomer. We're not using 20 languages. We're probably using one, maybe two. So the idea that you could provide a system with 3 different languages and we wouldn't get upset is wrong. We will get upset. More than one language, we are going to get upset. Sorry about that. User stories are not something that only need to exist within software development. Documentation is served very well by this idea as well. In fact, some would say it's even better than software. With the documentation, you're always saying, who is my reader? What do they know? What do they need to know? And by doing that, you get a much clearer idea on what your developers are actually wanting, so you can provide it in a much simpler and more direct fashion. So for example, I as a developer wish to send an SMS as part of a 2-factor authentication system. Now, I probably have a lot of other back-end things I've already written. I just want a call that says send text message. But the reality is that there's a lot more to it. And that should be explained and that should be covered directly. Not a piece over there and a piece over there, but a single page saying this is a user story that someone will do. It's one page in a doc saying you need to log in and or sign up. You need to get an API key, some form of token that lets me programmatically call this API. I then need to call this API. I then need to get the results from that API. Now, these are all obvious things, and they probably exist in everyone's documentation. But unless they exist in one place with a very obvious way to get from one to the other, the end user has got to fight in order to be able to get into the product. Now, the problem part is the middle part, where you say, well, what language do I put it in? There are so many languages that you could pick any of them. Some people use curl. It's a nice basic level. Obviously, it's command line, so you're going to exclude a few people there. But you can't do Node because that excludes the Go programmers and the PHP programmers. So what can you do? Well, you can provide any, all, or none of the above, as long as it's obvious how to find the rest of them. So thinking about this from a web developer point of view, there are tools out there such as Postman and Swagger that minimize the amount of work that you have to do to document these APIs. So in Swagger, for example, you'll describe the API, and then it will generate the code in Go and Node, curl, and probably a lot of other languages that I've not even heard of. You can also do this from Postman. Obviously, you need a little more typing in that, but essentially, you have a request that is made to an HTTP server, and you're able to then export that request in a variety of languages. You can then incorporate that into the docs. And you can format the docs in any way you like. So you can say, here is the curl request, click here to see the Node equivalent, click here to see the version in Go. And this would exist for everything in that list of instructions. You can just say, log into the system. But you should also be saying, if you'd like to know how you should be logging into the system, click here. Have the links to the login page available directly. Something I've found with a lot of telecoms, especially during TADHack, is that the name of the company that you originally sign up for is not the name of the company of the API. They're often different, maybe because the telecoms company has bought an API, or it started as one company and morphed into another, but the naming conventions and the URLs, they're all legacy. So a lot of the time you're going to a different location, so it isn't a case of just going to the URL in the address bar and changing it. You may often be directed to a different site. So if that's the case, it has to be written on that page, otherwise a developer will miss it in their rush to get things done. And it is a rush. Developers, for better or worse in the web community, are very focused on results. There is a copy and paste endemic right now, and has been thanks to Stack Overflow for many years. Developers are used to being able to go somewhere, copy, paste, make it work. If they're adding more than a couple of tokens into that code, there's probably something going wrong in the way you're presenting the information. I've seen some people, there have been some online APIs where if you're signed into the platform, it can actually make the request from the browser with your API keys directly. That's fantastic. That is a brilliant feature because it means you can see immediately what you need to type. You can copy and paste it from that page into your own code and it works identically. And because you're using your API key, it's using your credit, as in my web developer credit, and it's also using my web developer logs where I can see, oh yes, I sent a text message with this API call, the logs are reporting that API call, and I can see that I was charged 4 cents for that message, or whatever it is. So providing that is a very good way of reducing the friction, because they can literally copy and paste. MVP, or minimum viable product. There are probably statistics online, most of them probably false, that say that 90% of your users use only 10% of your functionality. That seems a bit of a round number to be a genuine statistic, but the ratios are probably right. You can probably write all of this code, but actually us developers are probably only using this much of it. Same is true of documentation. You can write masses on the whole API, detailing every single API call, which should be done. You can write masses of blog posts with every example you can think of, which you should do. But the reality is we're only going to use 10% of it. We're going to use whatever 10% we need to get our job done. So the real work is not having to write the documentation, it's having to find which 10% of that documentation should you write first. Welcome page, obviously. Some case studies, some examples. Show how to get API keys, how to use them, how to not get flummoxed when you see a curl request and you've never typed at the command line. A number of web developers have not used the command line extensively. So if they see a curl request, they might get a little bit scared. Show something next to it that says, no, if you don't want curl, here's Node. And as we said previously, it doesn't take a lot of work to support multiple languages for your API to provide that very frictionless way in for a developer. And like most development, it can be done in stages. So you do the first piece where you say, this is what you need to provide this functionality. Say the two-factor authentication example again. You can then expand on that to say, well, and here it is with a different programming language. And then once that's been implemented, you can say, and here it is where you can make the call from your browser. Each is a distinct step, and each can be done once you've proven that that page is getting the traction you expect. And then you can build up, increase the API coverage, have more details. And if you're releasing your libraries as open source, then they can always go back to the source code. I often get asked, at what level should you release the source code? And I say, every level as much as possible. I want a low-level API that does almost nothing but take a token and request to an endpoint. That's very simple. That's 5 lines of code in almost any language. That's essentially what I want from the main API. On top of that, I'd like other functionality, such as supplying the two-factor authentication code that I mentioned earlier, at which point the high level uses the load level. So I can see how I should be calling my code to do larger tasks. I can use your example as best practice for my example. And then you can build up the APIs in the same way that I would build up APIs, piece by piece, seeing what is actually needed and what can wait till next week. Try before you die. Now, I don't think this is particularly controversial in any way. We all expect to be able to trial this software before we actually start paying for it. But the important thing is here, don't make it too difficult to get a trial. We already feel a bit miffed when we have to give our email address, to be honest. I'm sure everyone does. You want to just see the content on this website? Sure, sign up here. Click here, would you like to fill in a survey? There are some websites I have to click 5 close boxes, cookies and newsletters and everything else just to get to a page of content. Might not even be relevant content when I get to read it. So we certainly worry about signing up, clicking on we have got your email link, then re-registering, then getting API keys. That's not to say there should be free for all, but whatever you can do to minimize that friction is always greatly appreciated on our side. If we like it, we will come back. Your company is not as important as you probably think it is. A lot of people will be thinking right now, yes, but if I don't have security on this and I don't have email sign-ups, someone will sign up with 100 different email addresses, they'll all get $10 of free SMS credit, and they'll just start spamming everyone. Well, they probably won't. If a hacker is going to that much effort to find your site and make all these requests, there are probably worse things they can do to your website and your infrastructure than get a few cheap text messages. Certainly easy to check for this stuff. I know once things are automated, checking becomes more difficult. But it certainly shouldn't be made annoyingly difficult for us to just get a hang of it, just see what the API is doing. And certainly you can make calls which cost nothing. Info calls, for example. Show me the status of my account. Cost nothing to support except for a few bytes of network traffic. It's not even sending messages at this point. But it is possible to talk to a server, use the API, test out the SDK, all without having to worry about it costing any physical money of sending messages or making calls. And certainly no problems of, is there likely to be spam involved in this service? And before we move on, I should probably say we're not just trialing the API. We're trialing the SDK itself. Do we actually like the way the module integrates with our system? We'll look at the GitHub history. Is it updated regularly enough to pull requests get accepted in a timely fashion? So if we find a problem or we've got fixes, are they going to get fed back quickly enough, or do we have to maintain our own sub-branch of your module? We're also going to be testing support as well. The reality is this is always a more important part of the package for me as a CTO level person than it is for any of the developers. Developing it should be a very small part of the process. It should be one element on the to-do list. Supporting that product is a lifetime of work. So we should also be able to trial your support lines. That may be a phone line, maybe for a week after sign up. That should be email, it should definitely be forums. There's got to be some way, because that's what we're testing as well. When so many companies are able to hook into the infrastructure to send messages, to accept and send voice calls, one of the things that will differentiate is the ability to handle support. And we would like to be testing support because the total cost of ownership from our side will mostly be based in support. Finally, we come to the very simple realization that you need people to do the job. Now, I said at the beginning, treat documentation like a product. And that goes with the staffing as well. As well as having someone to do the writing part, you also need someone to do the examples part. Now, if you have a writer that also knows code, then maybe that's the same person, but they are distinct roles, particularly as the person doing examples might be one of the tech leads from another team. You've got to think about QA. Who's going to check all of this text? Who's going to be checking these examples? One thing that you'll probably notice if you ever deal with Amazon to a certain extent is because it's been around for so long and there are so many people writing blogs and help pages on it, every other page is wrong because it all relates to an API from 5 years ago that doesn't exist anymore. And this is very true of particularly newer APIs. They're always changing slightly, and there's never quite enough information on the page for you to work out which version of the API this is, especially compared to what you need it to be to make your example work. So you will need someone to QA both the text and the code. Now, I talk about the text being QA'd. This is not someone that goes through and checks for typing mistakes or for grammatical errors. This is someone that says, can we say this to our customers? There might be part of an API that has a little special part to it, a little flag that says, send me back a full trace of what went on when I tried sending this message. That might be very useful to you for debugging and tracing purposes, but it might serve no purpose to an end user. In fact, it might be detrimental to the end user. The end user might look at it and go, oh, they're going through this system and that system. That might not be something you want to expose to the outside world. You'll have a certain nomenclature where you're saying, yes, we will call SMS SM message, or SMS will be called text message. There will be a certain use of language that will be consistent throughout the entire product, and QA will be there to ensure that happens. Again, it might not be the same person who is writing the text, and I would recommend that it's not the same person that writes the text, because they'll make the same mistake again, but someone else that can read through and says, yes, but we don't refer to our company with an uppercase here, we refer to that with a lowercase. You may have noticed, for those people that play games, especially from Nintendo, Sony and Microsoft, for example, They have a very particular language when talking about their controllers and the buttons on their controllers. That's because it's given to the developers. They have a system where if you're writing a game for Nintendo, they give you a big list of instructions, and I say list, it's actually 20 pages of lists, and when you talk about the A button on the controller, you have to call it with an uppercase A and an uppercase B. It's a very simple thing to do, but it's the sort of thing that gets missed. And if you give your game to Nintendo for release and it's got a mistake, they will send it back. They are doing essentially what QA should be doing to your documentation, so it looks consistent. It has a vision, it has a singular vision, and that all the documentation that you produce that goes out into the world has that singular vision. And that goes for blog posts as well. Blogs is something that might seem like a glorified example to a lot of people. A series of steps saying do this. But as we said, it puts all the information in one place. Copy and paste this big block of code into your own machine and it will do the job. That's one thing, that's a really good thing. But as important as that is the fact that it could be many blogs on many sites. Now this certainly helps improve your search engine techniques. You know, if you don't want to put a search engine on your site that does lots of clever things working out which example do they want, just have 100 blogs in the world and let Google reference them for you. So when someone searches SMS, two-factor authentication, how do I do this? It comes up with one of your blogs, or a blog from a partner, or a blog from someone that has used your system in the past. This is something that TADHack's done very well over the last few years. There are so many examples from TADHack of people using telephone APIs to do weird and interesting things. Why aren't you stealing them? I mean, using them. I mean, there is no copyright on an idea. And I know that because I've had my ideas copied as well. And that's fine. They're out there. They're there for copying. So if you see someone that says, hey, we're using a text message to control a robot, that's exactly the same as using a text message to light a light in the home, to use a hue control to turn the light on and off, to turn a fan on and off in an air-conditioned office. It's the same technology. Someone sends a text message, the backend does some processing, and an event happens. The only bit that changes is the end part. Do we turn the light on and off with hue? Do we turn the fan on and off? Do we play music? There's not a lot of real difference from the telecoms side. So for a lot of telecoms people, they go, well, why should I need to? Well, you don't need to, but the reason I would advocate that you do is because if someone looks for SMS and robot, they will come up with a very interesting blog post about sending SMS to robot. And that might inspire them to use yours over someone else's that has got an SMS robot example, or whatever the example is. Once you've got a couple of examples, you see it's very easy to be enthused by this idea and start writing a lot more examples around the same piece of very simple technology. And I know I've said you should hire as a team, and you really should. Just because you give someone a word processor doesn't mean they're going to be Shakespeare. Get a writer who can write. If you're going to conferences, get a presenter who can present. They might not be the same person. Someone that is good at writing text might not be the same person that's good at saying that text out loud. I know, I'm trying to do it to a camera right now. I know what's involved. It's difficult. But you should still look for those people. Get someone that writes the examples. Get them to write a good example. They should be coders. Not coders who may do some writing or some writers that might do some coding. Get two separate people, play to both strengths to produce the best form of documentation you can. And it might seem that it's going to be an expensive thing to do, hiring lots of separate people. And it might be. But you can say, well, what happens if we hire all these expensive people and we don't get any better documentation? And so, well, what happens if you don't hire them and you get the same bad documentation out? Where are they going to go? Where are those good people going? They're going somewhere else to write good documentation elsewhere. And I know everyone will say, hiring is difficult, we can't hire anyone. But I've never really found that to be completely true. It's true that finding the person you want is difficult. But that's usually because there's other parameters in play. It's usually things like, we can't find them because we're not paying them enough. We can't get them because they don't want to work in this part of the country, or they don't want to work for a company whose primary business is this. There's always another reason why hiring is difficult. If the whole equation is, we need to find a writer with 10 years experience who will work for peanuts, of course you're going to have trouble hiring. So to finish up, remember that telecoms is not their business, it's yours. You have to make it easy for them, not the other way round. Even if you think this phrase is not jargon, like DID or trunk for example, that to a web developer is going to be jargon. So again, in the QA cycle for the documentation, there should be something there to indicate that. Also, documentation is not the API. It is a part of the API, but as we said, things with blogs and examples, explanations and reasoning is all part of the documentation that needs to exist and needs to be put front and center. And as I've said, blog about this. This will get a lot more people coming in on different sites, different resources. And whilst you're doing so, eat your own dog food. Really, I don't mean that in the literal sense of the word, but metaphorically speaking. Have a hackathon of your own. Get the developer together. Let someone who normally works on this part of the code to hack something on this part. See how they find it. Particularly if they can't just ask the person on the desk next to them. What problems do they have? When they go to the documentation, what route do they take through? Do they find the information they're after? Can they build something interesting and creative? There's a lot of creative people out there doing a lot of creative things. And you don't have to do anything original. By creative, I don't mean original, I just mean interesting. There are plenty of ideas out there that you can take, which are no longer original because they're out there, but you can creatively make them in-house and then talk about them on the blog so people see, I could do this or I could do that. Because essentially, if there are more examples out there of how your API works, it's likely to be closer to what someone actually wants. Certainly, speaking from my perspective, when I write something in a new platform or new language, I take a piece of code that works and I fiddle around with it until it does what I want. So if there is a blog example that you've written about something that's very close to what I want, I'm more likely to go with that because I've got to make fewer changes to it than I would someone else's blog that has a lot of changes needed. So in conclusion, developers probably don't hate you. They probably don't hate your API either. They probably just wish it was a little bit easier to get into, or it wouldn't ask so many questions of them or force them to jump through so many hoops. I don't have access to the company credit card. Why should I? So if I've got to give a credit card to try out an API, I'm going to be very wary about putting my own in. I'll just look for someone that doesn't need my credit card. So I'm not hating you, I just don't want to do it. Also remember that these external developers are a much bigger part of your world than they are of yours. I mean, that you are a feature to them. And that's not to demean the work that goes on. But it's a feature, it's one feature on 100 Jira tasks that we've got to get through in the next week. If we can get that done, with a minimum amount of effort, we are going to like you more. We are more likely to say, yeah, this is working for us, it just worked. And as we finished up on documentation and developer relations, whether that's writing blog posts or go to conferences to talk about this with people, it's very, very important. This is the interface between you and the developers. If you've ever used a piece of software and thought, this is stupid, why is the button here and not here? Imagine what that's like for a developer using a telecoms software that they don't know anything about telecoms. All of a sudden it's a weird new world and they're going to get confused. So I think that's everything for now. My name is still Steve and I'm still a bit of a geek. I hope you've enjoyed the session. I can be contacted if you've got any follow-up questions. But otherwise, thank you all. As they say, back to Alan in the studio.